My name is Anne Root. I'm 32 years old, and I make a living designing contingency models for a logistics firm outside Seattle, the kind of job where you imagine what breaks before it ever does. I get paid to assume that people will miss deadlines, that systems will fail, that good intentions will buckle under pressure. Even with that resume, nothing prepared me for the voicemail that arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Right as I was annotating a risk matrix and debating whether my coffee had gone cold on purpose, it was my older brother's voice, clipped and strangely rehearsed, like he was reading terms and conditions. And Mom and Dad talked. We think it's best if you step back from family decisions for a while. Don't come by. Don't interfere. We're moving forward without you. No argument. No explanation. No space for questions. Just a clean erasure delivered in 11 seconds. I sat there longer than I'd like to admit, phone in my hand, feeling the old reflex rise, the one that tells you to smooth things over, to prove you're useful enough to keep. Instead, the professional part of my brain clicked on, calm and almost bored. I didn't call him back. I didn't ask what I'd done wrong. I sent one message. Understood. Then I opened my laptop and did what I do best. For years, I'd quietly handled the infrastructure behind my parents. Small but complicated finances. The trust that held their house, the joint account that paid my dad's medical bills, the LLC that owned a pair of delivery vans, my brother liked to call his business. My name wasn't flashy on paper, but it was everywhere that mattered. By noon, I'd tightened permissions, documented approvals, and paused anything that relied on my credit or guarantees. Nothing dramatic, just the removal of assumptions. I notified the bank that all future changes required my written consent. I emailed the accountant to suspend any restructuring until further notice. I stepped out of a lease renewal my brother had been counting on, politely and in writing. When I finally stood up to reheat my coffee, I realized something unsettling and clarifying. The silence from my family hadn't hurt because they'd cut me off emotionally. It hurt because they assumed I'd keep providing access after being told I was no longer welcome. They were wrong. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt precise. And as the rain traced thin lines down my office window, I understood that being told to step back wasn't the end of my role in the story. It was the moment I stopped playing it for free. The consequences of that 11-second voicemail arrived faster than I expected. By the next morning, my phone looked like it had survived a minor electrical storm, missed calls from my brother, 2 from my mother, 1 from an unfamiliar number with a local area code, and a voicemail marked urgent. I didn't listen to it right away. I've learned that urgency is often just panic wearing a nicer jacket. I showered, got dressed, and drove to work through traffic that moved like it had all the time in the world. Only once I was seated at my desk did I put in my earbuds and hit play. The unfamiliar number belonged to a financial advisor. I vaguely recognized someone my brother had mentioned at Thanksgiving, the kind who talked fast and smiled too much. "And this is Rick Palmer," he said, breathless. "We've run into a complication with your parents' accounts. Please call me back as soon as possible." Complication was his word for the system no longer bends the way we assumed it would. My mother's text followed a predictable arc. First confusion, "Why aren't you answering?" Then reassurance, "Your brother didn't mean it like that." Then bargaining, "Let's just talk this out." What struck me was what wasn't there. No apology. No curiosity about how it felt to be dismissed like a faulty part. Just an expectation that I'd smooth the friction like I always had. At lunch, my coworker Lila noticed I was quiet and asked if everything was okay. I told her the truth in a single sentence. My family fired me from a job I wasn't paid for. She winced in recognition. "Be careful," she said. "People get real philosophical about family. Right up until the spreadsheet stops cooperating." She wasn't wrong. That afternoon, I finally returned Rick's call. I kept my voice neutral as he explained that my brother had requested changes new signature authority, revised ownership language, a temporary adjustment that somehow excluded me. "He said you were overwhelmed and wanted space," Rick added. as if offering context instead of propaganda. I want to be clear, I replied. I have not authorized any changes, temporary or otherwise. Please treat any request that doesn't come directly from me as invalid. There was a pause on the line, then a careful, understood. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt awake. That evening, my mother finally called, her voice trembling in a way that would have pulled me back in a month earlier. "We didn't think you'd take it so literally," she said. I almost laughed. "You told me to step back," I replied. So I did. There was a long silence, the sound of consequences settling into the room on her end where, for the first time, I understood something essential. Boundaries don't create conflict. They reveal where it already lives. And once revealed, you can stop pretending it's your job to manage everyone else's comfort at the expense of your own stability. By the third day, the story about me had already started circulating without my participation, which, I learned, is often how the most dangerous versions are born. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in months texted to ask if I was doing okay. An old family friend left a comment on my social media about rest being important. No. One asked me what actually happened. They were reacting to a version of events that painted me as fragile, erratic, and in need of being managed for my own good. That framing wasn't accidental. It excused the decision to sideline me while quietly justifying why my access should be redistributed. I recognized it immediately because I'd seen the same tactic in failing organizations: discredit the system, then claim control as a form of rescue. Instead of reacting emotionally, I did what calms me when uncertainty spikes. I gathered data. I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it plainly Family Documentation. Inside it went screenshots of messages, timestamps of calls, copies of emails, and notes from conversations I'd already had. Not because I planned to use them, but because clarity requires records when narratives start drifting. That night, my brother finally called. He sounded exhausted and annoyed. The way people do when they're inconvenienced by resistance they didn't expect. "You didn't have to lock everything down," he said. "Mom's really upset." I kept my voice steady. "You told me to step back." "I did. Access is part of the role you asked me to leave." He sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "You're being dramatic." I almost smiled. Dramatic is a word people use when they want the benefits of your involvement without the accountability of respecting you. "Send me in writing what changes you're asking for and why," I said. "We can review them with a third party." He didn't like that. "Why are you turning this into a legal thing?" he asked. "Because it already is," I replied. After we hung up, my mother sent a long message about family loyalty, about how money shouldn't come between people who love each other. I read it twice before answering. "Money isn't between us," I wrote. "Assumptions are." The next morning, I received an email from the accountant, carefully worded, asking me to confirm my position on several proposed changes. I replied with a single sentence: "I do not consent to any modifications without joint review." The sentence did more work than hours of emotional conversation ever had. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly things escalated. It was how quickly the leverage disappeared once I stopped absorbing pressure. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was simply no longer cushioning the impact of choices I hadn't made. And in that space between who they thought I'd always be and who I was choosing to be, felt something unfamiliar but steady take hold. Not distance, alignment for the first time. My actions matched my worth. And I wasn't negotiating either. The meeting happened the following Sunday at my parents' house, the same place where every important conversation in our family had always taken place: birthdays, reconciliations, quiet financial rescues no one ever named out loud. One arrived early on purpose, parked on the street instead of the driveway, and walked in with a slim folder under my arm. My mother hugged me too tightly, like she was afraid I might vanish if she let go. My brother stayed seated, arms crossed, already defensive. We didn't waste time on pleasantries. Let's be clear about why we're here, I said once we sat down. I was told to step back. Since then, decisions have been made using my name and my role without my consent, my brother scoffed. You're acting like we tried to steal from you. I met his eyes. Intent doesn't change impact. That quieted the room. I opened the folder and laid out a simple timeline: dates, requests, assumptions. No accusations, just sequence. The accountant's email. The advisor's voicemail. The messages that described me as overwhelmed without ever checking in. My mother's face shifted as the pattern became visible. Not as isolated misunderstandings, but as a coordinated push. We thought you wanted out, she said softly. I wanted respect, I replied. There's a difference. My brother leaned forward. So what? Now we need your permission for everything? I shook my head. No, you need clarity. Either I'm involved with transparency and boundaries, or I'm not involved at all. What doesn't work is pretending. I'm gone while still using what I built. Silence stretched. Finally, my father spoke, voice steady. We relied on you without realizing how much, he admitted, and we listened to the story that made that reliance feel safer. My brother bristled, but didn't interrupt. That was news. We talked for nearly 2 hours, not in circles but in lines. What existed? Who controlled it? What assumptions had been made? There were moments of defensiveness, moments of guilt, but also something else. Relief. Systems function better when roles are named. By the end, we agreed on terms that felt less like reconciliation and more like restructuring. I would either be formally involved, with documented authority and limits, or fully disengaged, with no informal access or expectations. No more just handle it, no more narrative spoken on my behalf. When I left, my mother walked me to the door. I didn't realize how much we asked without asking, she said. I nodded. I didn't realize how much I gave without choosing, I replied. Driving home, I felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because it was finally defined. Clarity doesn't heal every wound, but it stops new ones from forming in the dark. What followed wasn't dramatic reconciliation or explosive fallout. It was something quieter and in many ways harder. Adjustment. Systems don't like change, and families are just emotional systems with longer memories. The first week after the meeting, my phone stayed oddly calm. No frantic calls, no passive-aggressive messages dressed up as concern. Instead, there were emails measured, almost formal, looping me in where they should have all along. It felt strange seeing my name treated like a role instead of a reflex. I noticed how often my brother paused before speaking now. How he checked facts instead of assuming agreement. It wasn't humility exactly. It was friction, and friction, I've learned, is what honesty feels like when people aren't used to it. One afternoon, my mother called to ask a simple question about a bill. Not to hand it off, just to understand it. We spent 20 minutes walking through numbers, and when we hung up, she thanked me, not for fixing it, for explaining it. That was new too. At work, I found myself more focused than I'd been in months. It turns out that carrying unspoken family obligations is like running background software. You don't notice the drain until it's gone. I stopped bracing for emergencies that weren't mine to solve. I slept better. I laughed more easily. Meanwhile, the extended family noise faded once there was nothing for it to feed on. Stories need oxygen. Documentation starves them. My brother tested the boundaries once, asking if I could just take a look at something outside the agreed structure. I said no, politely and without justification. He didn't push. That, more than any apology, told me the reset had taken. A few weeks later, we signed revised documents. Clean, limited, explicit. My role was clear. So were its edges. As the pen left the paper, I felt something settle that I hadn't realized was unstable. My sense of authorship over my own life. I wasn't the silent guarantor anymore. I was a participant by choice. That distinction changed everything. On a Sunday evening, not long after, I sat alone on my balcony, watching the city lights come on, thinking about how Isaly's loyalty can be confused with obligation. How often women, especially, are taught that being capable means being endlessly available. I didn't regret helping my family in the past, but I did regret how long it took me to understand that help without consent is just another form of control, sometimes self-inflicted. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about money or documents or even conflict. It's about authorship, about deciding who gets to write your role and under what conditions. I wasn't cast out because I failed. I was pushed aside because I stopped being convenient. And choosing not to return to that convenience wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Time did what it usually does after boundaries are enforced. It revealed who respected them and who merely tolerated them. My parents adjusted first. They asked before assuming, learned enough to be dangerous in a spreadsheet, and stopped treating my competence like a shared utility. My brother took longer. He oscillated between cooperation and quiet resentment. As if he were waiting for me to slip back into the old rhythm. I didn't. When he complained about stress, I listened without fixing. When he hinted at financial pressure, I acknowledged it without solving it. The absence of my intervention forced him to confront problems directly, and I could see how unfamiliar that felt to him. One afternoon, he admitted something he'd never said out loud. I thought if I didn't step in, everything would fall apart, I answered honestly. That fear kept me trapped, too. There was no fight after that. Just a recalibration neither of us had language for yet. Outside the family, the shift echoed in subtle ways. Friends noticed I was less apologetic, more decisive. At work, my manager remarked that I'd started delegating instead of absorbing risk alone. I realized I'd been practicing for this moment my entire career, designing systems that didn't depend on a single point of failure. Somehow I'd never applied that logic to myself. One evening while organizing old files, I found notes from years earlier, reminders to check in on bills, to cover gaps, to anticipate needs before anyone voiced them. I deleted half of them, not out of spite, but out of accuracy. Those reminders belonged to a version of me who believed love meant preemptive sacrifice. The current version believed love could survive a no. A month later, my mother told me she'd turned down a suggestion from a relative who wanted me to just handle something. We're learning, she said, a little proud. I smiled. Learning is expensive when you avoid it. It's liberating when you embrace it. I thought about the voicemail that started all of this, the casual dismissal. The assumption that I'd disappear quietly while my contributions lingered. In a way, it did me a favor. It exposed the imbalance I'd normalized. It forced a reckoning I'd postponed out of fear of being seen as difficult. I wasn't difficult. I was clear. And clarity, I've learned, is uncomfortable only to people who benefit from confusion. As I looked ahead, I didn't feel hardened. I felt lighter. My relationships were fewer, but truer. My energy was my own, and for the first time, the systems I built at work, at home, within myself were designed to protect the most critical asset of all, my agency. The real test came when nothing was wrong. No crisis, no overdue bill, no dramatic family meeting to justify my involvement. Just an ordinary Tuesday evening when my brother called and said, "We're thinking about selling one of the vans in the past." That sentence would have triggered a cascade market analysis, tax implications, replacement timelines before he'd even finished speaking. This time I paused. "What are you thinking?" I asked. There was a beat of silence, then a sigh. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought you'd tell me," and there it was. Exposed without malice. The old expectation that my certainty would substitute for his responsibility. "I can walk you through how to evaluate it," I said. "But I'm not deciding," he agreed, a little reluctantly. And we set a time. When we talked later, I asked questions instead of giving answers. What did he need the cash for? What would replacing the van cost? What risk was he trying to reduce? He struggled, but he stayed in the discomfort. When we hung up, I felt an unfamiliar pride, not in myself, but in the process. This was what sustainable involvement looked like. Around that time, I noticed how differently I spoke about my family to friends. No more half jokes. About being the responsible. 1. No more casual self-erasure. Disguised as humor, I wasn't managing impressions anymore. I was telling the truth, and the truth was simpler than I'd made it. I loved them, but I wasn't built to be their infrastructure. One weekend, my parents invited me over for dinner. No agenda, no paperwork, just food. My mother asked about my work, genuinely curious. My father talked about a project he'd figured out on his own, and looked quietly pleased. After dessert, my mom said, "You seem lighter." I nodded. "I am." She didn't apologize again. She didn't need to. Accountability had already done the work apologies usually pretend to do. Driving home that night, I thought about how often people frame boundaries as walls, when really they're load-bearing beams. They hold things up so they don't collapse. I hadn't lost my family by insisting on limits. I'd lost the illusion that love required exhaustion. And that illusion, once gone, didn't come back. I didn't know what the future would hold. Families are dynamic systems. After all, but I knew this much. Whatever happened next would involve choice, mine included, and that made all the difference. I didn't realize how deeply the shift had settled until a quiet moment caught me off guard. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, the kind that blurs the city into soft gray shapes. And I was reorganizing my apartment, not decluttering, just recentering. As I moved a stack of folders from one shelf to another, one found the old notebook I used to carry everywhere. The one filled with reminders, backup plans, and names circled in red. I flipped through it slowly. Almost every page was a contingency for someone else's life. If Dad's hours get cut, if Mom's prescription changes, if my brother needs a bridge loan. There were very few notes about me. No dreams, no timelines, no space reserved for uncertainty that belonged to my future. I sat on the floor with that realization heavier than any argument we'd had. It wasn't that my family had demanded everything. It was that I'd preemptively offered it, mistaking preparedness for purpose. That afternoon, I made a list, not of risks, but of intentions. Travel I'd postponed, a certification I'd wanted but never prioritized. Even rest, written plainly as if to prove it counted. When my phone buzzed, I half expected a request. Instead, it was my mother sending a photo of a plant she'd reported successfully. "Did it myself," the caption read, followed by a smiley face that felt earned. I smiled back. The system was holding. Weeks passed without incident, which is how, a design works. My brother called less, but when he did, it was specific. My parents made decisions and lived with them. I started saying yes to things that had nothing to do with family dinners. Trips, opportunities that once felt indulgent. The guilt I'd expected didn't arrive. In its place was a steadiness I hadn't known I was missing. One evening, a colleague asked me how I'd gotten so good at managing risk. I thought about it before answering. "By learning where it actually belongs," I said. "Not everything is yours to prevent. Not every failure is yours to absorb." That understanding had changed how I moved through the world. I was still reliable, still thoughtful, still capable, but no longer automatically available. And that difference was everything. Looking back, I can see the moment clearly now. The voicemail wasn't a rejection. It was an accidental invitation to step into authorship. To decide, deliberately, what I would protect and what I would release. I didn't lose my family. I lost a role that was costing me more than it gave back, and in doing so, I gained something far more durable than approval. I gained myself. The story doesn't end with triumph or punishment, and that's the part I trust the most about it. It ends with maintenance, with choices repeated quietly, long after the lesson stops feeling dramatic. Months later, I still get the occasional, "To Jen," offhand comment about how you'd know. Better, a pause on the phone where someone waits to see if I'll step in. Sometimes I do when I choose to. More often I don't, and the world doesn't end. Bills get paid, Mistakes get made and owned by the people who made them. Love survives without constant rescue. That realization changed how I define strength. Is not the ability to carry everything without complaint. It's the discipline to carry only what's yours. I think about that Thursday morning sometimes, about how casually my brother said, "Don't interfere," as if my presence had always been an inconvenience instead of a stabilizer. I don't resent him for it anymore. People don't always know what they're asking for when they push someone away. Sometimes they're really asking to find out what happens next. What happened next for us was honesty. Awkward, imperfect honesty that required everyone to grow up a little. My parents learned that love doesn't mean outsourcing responsibility to the most capable child. My brother learned that authority without accountability collapses under its own weight. And I learned that self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand applause. It just quietly changes the rules you live by. If someone listening to this recognizes themselves in any part of my story, the fixer, the buffer, the unspoken safety net, I want you to hear this clearly. Being dependable does not mean being disposable. You are allowed to step back when the cost of staying in exceeds the value of being seen. You are allowed to let people experience the full weight of their choices without cushioning the fall. That isn't cruelty, it's reality. And reality, unlike guilt, actually teaches. Today, my life feels less crowded and more intentional. I still model worst-case scenarios for a living, but I no longer live as one for the people I love. I invest my energy where it's reciprocated, my care where it's respected, and my time where it's chosen, not assumed. If there's one thing I'd pass on, it's this. When someone tells you to step back, believe them the first time, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Step back far enough to see what you've been holding together alone. Then decide consciously, calmly, what you're willing to pick up again, and under what conditions. That decision isn't revenge. It isn't abandonment. It's authorship. And once you claim it, you don't need anyone else's permission to keep it.